There was a time when people wanted to look sick. A deadly disease became a strange symbol of beauty and status, transforming a medical horror into a cultural obsession. By the end of this story, you will understand the dark psychology that allowed a plague to become fashionable. How did a feverish flush and a pale, wasting body become the ultimate beauty ideal? What does it say about us when suffering is mistaken for style? Why do you think societies sometimes fall in love with what should terrify them? The pale, gaunt figure became an icon. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a profound and unsettling shift occurred in the way society viewed tuberculosis. The disease, widely known then as consumption, shed its identity as a horrifying plague and was curiously reborn as a romantic affliction. This was not a medical change, but a cultural one. The very symptoms that signaled a body in distress were reinterpreted as marks of beauty and refinement. The persistent fever painted a permanent, rosy flush on the cheeks, mimicking the most sought-after cosmetic blush. The body's wasting away created a slender, delicate silhouette that became the ultimate physical ideal, a stark contrast to more robust figures. Eyes, bright and glassy from fever, were seen as windows to a soul burning with passionate intensity. Even the profound weakness and lethargy, the languid pace of a consumptive's life, was not viewed as debilitating. Instead, it was interpreted as a sign of a sensitive, artistic nature, a person too refined and deep for the vulgar energies of the everyday world. This romantic perception was a complete reversal of the terror that had surrounded the disease for centuries. So what allowed this strange beauty to bloom from such a dark root? The answer lies in a powerful cultural wave known as Romanticism. This artistic and literary movement, which swept across Europe, celebrated intense emotion over cold reason. It prized individuality, a tortured soul, and a deep fascination with death and the sublime. Dying young, especially from a disease that seemed to elevate the spirit as it consumed the body, was framed not as a tragedy, but as a poignant, beautiful release. Artists and writers became powerful propagandists for this deadly aesthetic. They created consumptive heroines and poets, characters whose pale beauty and tragic fates were presented as the height of romantic appeal. This cultural engine systematically repackaged a horrific medical reality into a desirable, almost fashionable, state of being. This romantic obsession did not stay confined to poetry and paintings. It escaped the page and began to dictate the very faces and figures people saw in the mirror. A new aesthetic was born, one so powerful it reshaped fashion and beauty ideals across society. Women actively sought the consumptive look, transforming the symptoms of a deadly illness into a carefully crafted appearance. The feverish flush, once a sign of the body's desperate struggle, became the most desirable cosmetic effect. Women would apply circles of rouge high on their cheeks, a deliberate imitation of the disease's characteristic rosy glow. To replicate the famous bright, glassy eyes of a consumptive, some turned to a dangerous substance, belladonna. Drops of this poison would dilate their pupils, creating a wide-eyed, luminous gaze that was seen as intensely passionate and soulful. The ideal body was not just slender, it was spectral. Corsets were tightened to extremes, cinching waists to an impossibly small size that mirrored the physical wasting of tuberculosis. This created a silhouette of fragility, a body that looked as though it were fading away. Pale, almost translucent skin was paramount. To achieve this ghostly complexion, women used lead-based cosmetics, a poison that whitened the skin at a terrible cost, or they simply shunned the sunlight, associating a healthy tan with the vulgarity of manual labor. Fashion followed this morbid blueprint. Delicate, flowing gowns in light colors like white and soft pastels became the rage. These fabrics emphasized a frail and ethereal appearance, making the wearer seem as if she were barely tethered to the earth. An entire culture was now dressing for a sickness, celebrating a look that whispered of a beautiful decline. But how did this disturbing trend escape the drawing rooms of the elite and become a public spectacle? The answer lies in the power of a new kind of celebrity. The stage and the page became the most powerful engines of this deadly glamour. Writers and artists did not merely observe the consumptive trend, they became its most passionate architects, transforming a biological reality into a romantic archetype. The poet John Keats was not just a victim of tuberculosis, he became its poster child. His suffering, his feverish productivity, and his tragically early death were framed by his contemporaries and later admirers as the ultimate sacrifice for art. He was the embodiment of the romantic ideal, a brilliant soul being consumed by the very intensity of his own genius. This narrative was heartbreakingly compelling. It suggested that such profound creativity and sensitivity were incompatible with a long, healthy life, that to be a true artist was to burn brightly and fade quickly. The story was repeated with the Bronte sisters. The world watched and read as these brilliant young women from a remote parsonage produced some of literature's most passionate works, only to be struck down one by the same disease. Their real-life tragedies bled into the public's perception of their fiction, making the pale, doomed heroines of novels like Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre feel all the more authentic and poignant. Consumption was the thread that connected their art to their lives, making it seem like an almost inevitable fate for those who felt and loved too deeply. But perhaps the most effective piece of propaganda for the consumptive aesthetic was an opera. Giuseppe Verdi's La Traviata placed a beautiful, charismatic courtesan, Violetta, at the center of a tragic love story. Her defining characteristic, besides her capacity for love, is her illness. She is pale, she coughs delicately into a handkerchief, and she ultimately sacrifices her own happiness and dies a beautiful, heartbreaking death. Audiences did not leave the opera house fearing tuberculosis. They left weeping for the beautiful Violetta. Her death was not portrayed as the gruesome, contagious end it was in reality, but as a spiritual release, a final, noble act of love. This was the ultimate reframing. These cultural works were not simple mirrors reflecting a societal quirk. They were active lessons in perception. They taught a willing public how to view the disease, instructing them to see a hacking cough not as a sound of distress, but as a sign of a passionate heart. They encouraged people to see a wasting body not as a medical emergency, but as a vessel for a superior, ethereal spirit. The pale, sickly heroine of a novel was not pitied for her poor health. She was admired for her interesting pallor and profound soul. This artistic campaign successfully detached the image of consumption from its medical horror, wrapping it instead in the seductive cloak of genius, refinement, and tragic romance. But this romantic fantasy was built on a foundation of brutal biological truth. What was the grim, unglamorous reality happening inside a consumptive's body, a reality the artist so carefully ignored? The romantic image of the delicate, fading consumptive was a comforting lie. The medical reality was a brutal, unending assault on the human body. Far from a gentle decline, tuberculosis was a slow, violent suffocation. It began with a cough, a persistent, hacking sound that would not cease. This was not a delicate clearing of the throat. It was a deep, wrenching convulsion that tore through the chest. As the disease progressed, that cough would bring up thick, foul-smelling phlegm, and eventually, bright red blood. The body wasted away not into a graceful slenderness, but into a skeletal state of starvation, as the fever burned through muscle and fat at a terrifying rate. Victims were plagued by drenching night sweats, waking in soaked bedding, shivering and exhausted. The most terrifying symptom was the slow destruction of the lungs themselves. The bacteria literally dug cavities into the delicate tissue, turning the organs that gave life into ragged, useless ruins. The end was not a peaceful drifting off to sleep. It was a conscious, agonizing struggle for every single breath, a feeling of drowning on dry land. This was the truth behind the fashionable pallor and the delicate silhouette. For the wealthy in their well-appointed drawing rooms, this suffering could be aestheticized from a distance. But for the urban poor, crammed into airless tenements, there was no romance. In these overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, tuberculosis was not a mark of a sensitive soul. It was a death sentence that ripped through entire families. It was a disease of poverty and filth, and it was rightly, viscerally feared. The romantic myth could only survive while the cause remained a mystery. That all changed in 1882. A German physician named Robert Koch made a monumental discovery. He identified the specific bacterium that caused tuberculosis, finally proving it was an infectious disease. not a spiritual condition or a mark of artistic temperament. He showed the world the enemy, a tiny, rod-shaped germ that could be passed from person to person through the air. This single scientific breakthrough began to dismantle the romantic fantasy. You could not call a germ romantic. You could not frame a bacterial infection as a beautiful tragedy. The discovery forced a profound shift in perception, pulling the disease out of the realm of poetry and back into the harsh light of medical science. It was the beginning of the end for consumption's fashionable reign, but the story of its cultural power was far from over. Koch's discovery of the bacterium stripped the romantic veil from tuberculosis, but the aesthetic it inspired proved strangely resilient. We are left with the incredible journey of a plague that became a beauty standard, a clear testament to the dangerous power of culture over fact. For over a century, a devastating biological reality was systematically reinterpreted through the lens of art and literature. Society was taught by its most admired creators to see a wasting body not as a medical emergency, but as a symbol of a refined and passionate spirit. The cough was recast as a sigh of profound emotion, and the pallor of death became the height of fashionable allure. This was a complex dance between medicine, art, and society, where perception did not just distort reality, it completely inverted it. The legacy of this tubercular chic lingers even today, not in a desire for illness, but in our continued fascination with the tragic artist and the romantic notion of burning out too young. It serves as a powerful, unsettling reminder that our fears and desires can be powerfully manipulated, leading us to celebrate what we should rightly fear. So where does this strange story leave us? Look around at our modern world. Can you think of any current trends where health or body image might be similarly misguided? Where the pursuit of an ideal could be masking a deeper, potentially harmful reality? The past urges us to look more critically at the present. If you have thoughts, share them in the comments below. Subscribe for more journeys into history's most fascinating mysteries, and consider how these strange stories from our past can help us see our own world with clearer, more questioning eyes.